Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to a realm where reality intertwines with the inexplicable, where the boundaries of reason dissolve into the shadows of uncertainty. Welcome to the political twilight zone. I am your guide through this enigmatic labyrinth, where politics and power take on life of their own. In this dimension, the threads of truth weave a tapestry of intrigue, challenging our perception of the world we thought we knew. In this world, nothing is as it seems, and the truth lies buried beneath layers of deceit. Prepare to venture where reason meets the unexplained, and where the unexplained might just be the ultimate truth.
Hey, everybody, we're back. Another week goes by. God, these weeks, gosh darn it, these weeks are flying by. I have to say, it just seems like I record the show, talk to a few people, walk out, have a sandwich. It's Friday or Saturday again. I think that's because so many different things are happening right now. So, welcome back. Thanks for joining everybody. It's Rick Wagner here, getting it right on Kansas KGLN and on the internet and podcasts and, several other places. So it's hard to get away from us, really. One thing right off the top that I wanted to bring up is a couple people had asked me, because I'd mentioned it before, the use of canes and walking sticks in Congress. Some of you remember that there was an incident where canes and such things were banned in the Senate for sure. And you were wondering, what happened with that? And well, I can tell you the background on it, right? There was a senator in 1856, Charles Sumner, who was attacked by Representative Preston Brooks. This was in the Senate well. Representative Preston Brooks of South Carolina brutally beat Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts with a cane on the Senate floor, shocked the nation, further divided the sexual divide leading up to the Civil War. Now, this was not just like popping him on once or twice. He got beaten and was seriously injured by this. You may recall that people, well, to this day, some of the canes that they carried were heavy. They had brass or metal heads on them. They were pretty good clubs, really. And many people carried them not just for style at that time, but also for protection. And so it was decided at that point, there was no immediate rule banning them, but it was discussed that they should be. And there just wasn't any brought back in. And, of course, some of the southern senators and representatives decided to carry their walking sticks and whatnot anyway in just sort of in rebellion against any sort of code that was trying to be established to keep weapons off the floor. In the 20th century, though, of course, we have all kinds of bans on things. If you try and get to the Capitol, there's no specific ban on bringing canes or clubs, I guess. With canes, if a club, I think they probably would if you brought a caveman club in with you to the chambers. But now we're seeing, Al Green, not the singer, waving his cane about. This seems to be his new thing. I mean, every time I've seen him on, it's the cane in the air, shaking it around. It's kind of weirdly semi-threatening, I will have to say. And then in this last little talk that President Trump had in there, you'll notice that Nancy Pelosi had what appeared to be kind of a larger walking stick that she was using. Now, this seems perfectly fine. I mean, people wear crutches and all sorts of things when they come into those places. But it is interesting when you start seeing Al Green again starting to wave that thing around. And it reminded people, say, didn't something happen a long time, and some of you really remember, it's like, wasn't around the Civil War or something where someone got attacked with a cane? Yeah, they did. And it was a big deal. And it showed that there was not just political problems there, but there was a lot of personal problems that were deriving from political beliefs at that time. And I don't think we're quite that bad yet, but sometimes it feels like we're headed that way, doesn't it? Look, you guys have heard all week about the behavior of the Democrats during President Trump's speech. Many of you watched it. I have to say that of the politicians that I've watched over the years, I am much more inclined to watch President Trump more than just about anybody. And he's interesting to watch. I like to hear what he has to say. And his manner of speaking is so conversational with people. And he seems to have, like, no fear of saying what comes on his mind, which is so refreshing when you're listening to politicians. I think that's what draws you in. And his speech was, I think, the longest. Bill Clinton had the record before, and this speech was longer. And I can remember some of Bill Clinton's speeches. Bill Clinton was a great speaker. You know, many of you can remember that. People would say how Obama was a great. Obama was, and I've said this so many times, Obama couldn't hold a candle to Clinton when it came to speaking. Obama can speak from a script and sound as though he's trying to sound, you know, high and the mighty, but it never really reaches that sort of connection with the audience that Bill Clinton always had. He understood his room. He understood the audience. You know, reading your room a little bit has something to do with, like, poor Zelensky. He didn't seem to read the room very well. Of course, he was hyped up by a bunch of Democrats to go in there and do that, it appears to be. But anyway, Obama never really read the room. He just lectured you. He lectured people. And as you can see, his ability to understand his audience has gotten even worse. During this last campaign, where he was chastising people for voting voting for Trump or being interested in Trump if they were part of the black community, things like that, he was really kind of tone deaf, or as I like to say, kind of having a tin ear on that. He just didn't hear, it didn't sound right. But things are getting pretty wild. And I always think that it gets more dangerous. I don't want to get too far ahead of myself on that. When people run out of ideas. And if you looked at that bunch of the Democrats this week with ping pong paddles and pink outfits and a couple of dry erase boards, I mean, this is a group of people who have run out of ideas. They're frustrated. Frustration and a lack of ideas leads to unstable behavior. Everybody knows that. And these guys have gotten quite a bit, or received quite a bit, of really strong pressure from the far left contingency of their constituents. Now, this is what they've cultivated. How long have they been going on about Trump, Republicans, now it's Musk, and I mean, you know, anybody else in there is, they're not just wrong, they're evil. And they're not just evil, but they're tremendously evil. And because of that, you push people to the idea that any step must be taken to stop that person. If you paint that person badly enough and really dehumanize them, then you push certainly a fringe of your more unstable constituents to thinking that I'm somehow going to be lauded if I do something crazy. And that seems to be growing because they can't really stop it because they don't have any other ideas, so they just kind of fall back on the same stuff. And if you take a little bit of time, and I don't recommend this because it just makes you want to sleep uneasily. If you look at some of the comments and things like that when you go to the real hard left Democrat websites and this and that, these people have been pushed to the point where they think that Republicans, kind of in general, Donald Trump in particular, now Elon Musk, are somehow out to do them some kind of physical harm in some bizarre way. And Democrats have pushed that narrative more by saying, you know, words matter and people will die if this, and some of this stuff, if you look at it, I mean, there's no logic to it. It's just jingoism, but it gets in people's heads. And when it gets in some of these people's heads, it justifies impulses and sort of an unhappy life that they already have, lets them direct it in a different way towards a different person, somehow blame them for that lifestyle, why they're not happy, and why, you know, the whole thing. And it points them in that direction. And that's something you always have to be leery about. I think most of us understand that. You don't just keep pushing people to get more and more upset about something because you want something to happen and it's not happening, so you just keep pushing it. Because how do you unwind that? This is the other thing. I mean, how do you come back and say, oh, well, we thought he was pretty much, the Third Reich there, but not so bad, and we can kind of. They don't seem to be able to do that because, first of all, they want to have this constant pressure on the Trump administration and everybody associated with him, and they don't know any other way to do it. Some of them aren't comfortable with what's happening, but they don't know what else to do. I think this being out of ideas and being riled up like this and having people push you? Really nutty things. Okay, thanks for sticking around for a little break there, folks. I appreciate it. Rick Wagner here, still getting it right on KZ, KGLN, Internet, and a few other places. I wanted to go back and touch on something that we've talked about several times before. It just sticks just under my saddle. It's a burr under my saddle. Is this weird thing we've developed the last 5 years of district court judges, federal district court judges, issuing injunctions and relief of some sort across the whole country. Now, it's not like this is the Supreme Court. It's not like there's just 4 or 5 of these dudes out there. They're all over the place. And we have a lot of really kind of funky ones out there. People appointed by Obama and some really interesting ones appointed by Biden. The ones that don't actually understand the Constitution. The ones that were asked questions about like, ooh, what's Article 2 about? Didn't know that. This is a bad sign for someone in the federal judiciary. But it's a good sign if they say things like, well, I think I'm on the side of, you name the left-wing idea. So that's how they get their job, for the most part. But this has just been going on. And so what happens is that you're able to do this forum shopping. Something happens in the executive branch that they make a rule that affects, say, an agency over that has some kind of control over all the states. So people have decided, lawyers have decided that they can go to any court in the country and ask for relief because the whole country is affected by this agency's actions. All right. So they just peck around until they find a judge that they believe is loopy enough in the right way to go their direction. And this is what happens. But so let's say some of this is true and some of it is up in the air. And it is. And here's why. Federal courts are courts of what's called limited jurisdiction. That means they're kind of restricted to causes, cases, and controversies, kind of in a specific geographic district. But lately, some judges have issued injunctions that extend over the entire country, like we were saying. We're not exactly sure, by we, I mean everybody, not exactly sure what the legal basis for this is. Some of the courts will say it's called equitable relief, which is, a very vague term. And it says that courts can craft remedies broad enough to fully resolve the harm against alleged by the plaintiff. All right. Think about that for a minute. Craft remedies broad enough to fully resolve the harm alleged by the plaintiff. Does that sound very limiting to you? No, because it's not. It's balderdash, I think is the old term for it. They also say that the Administrative Procedure Act, of all things, allows courts to set aside unlawful agency actions, like, say, the Treasury or ICE or ATF or you name it. All right. Some courts then say that since this is an agency action, it fits everybody, then they can block the actions of this all over the place. They also point to one of these federal rules of civil procedure, which once again is it's a rule generated by the courts, how they operate, and that governs injunctions and restraining orders. It grants courts discretion in how they shape relief. What does that got to do with the jurisdiction? Maybe I'm going to do nitpicky here. What does that got to do with your ability to hold people in California from your courtroom in Rhode Island from doing something? How does that work exactly? And then they have this really vague argument. Because, these federal judges are created from Article 3 of the Constitution. So they're called Article 3 judges. And you'll hear that every so often because there are people out there that administer federal jurisdiction, but they're not Article 3 judges. Magistrates, for instance. Magistrates are hired by the federal courts to do jobs that supposedly sort of, kind of cleaning up around so that the really big brain federal judges can just concentrate on that really important stuff. So they're not really Article 3 judges, so they don't have lifetime appointments or anything like that. They're essentially employees. Most states have magistrates or something like that too, where the district court judges can hire them to do the work they don't want to do, which in some judges it's all of it. But we have some good ones around. I have to say that. I have to be fair. Anyway, so they think that because they're in Article 3, that anything if it violates constitutional or federal law, not just constitutional law, but federal law, then they can say that extends to every party that's affected. Which, of course, in the case of an agency action for the federal government is pretty much everybody. So that's how they get this kind of strange idea that sounds not so correct to us, because I don't think it is. These are sort of collateral ideas, right? To try and explain away something that's, I want to do this, and how can I find a way to justify it? This is what it seems like to me. And what you get is this overreach, right? And then when you get overreach from these guys, then you get all this activism, because they have things put in front of them for the very reason that they're going to rule a certain direction and maybe find this to be something that's under their jurisdiction when somebody else may not. And even if it goes up to a higher court, say a Circuit Court of Appeals, which oversees a group of these district courts, or, of course, the Supreme Court, which oversees all of them, by the time that happens, usually a lot of time has passed. So, in instance, the damage is kind of done. I mean, can one judge in one district halt policies that affects the whole country? And can lawyers just, and litigants, I suppose, just find judges that they like their ideological leanings in some jurisdiction someplace and then get nationwide relief? It also creates a weird thing, too, where you have this lack of uniformity, which was the reason that these guys were limited in their jurisdiction to begin with. So that you don't have one person saying one thing, another person saying another, and they both are supposed to affect the same area. What in the past you've had is one of the courts will say something. It'll go up to the Circuit Court of Appeals. They'll decide how that interpretation is looked at. And if they uphold it or reverse it, or whatever the case may be, then that becomes the sort of case law for that jurisdiction. In other words, the courts under that Circuit Court of Appeals, not the whole country, just the Circuit of Appeals. And then if you start getting enough of these interpretations of something from different circuit courts, and we see that every so often, interpretations of the Second Amendment, interpretations of the Commerce Clause, something like that, the Supreme Court is then supposed to step in and find a case, because everybody's always appealing everything to the Supreme Court, that will somehow unify this. In other words, they're supposed to step in and find a case that will allow them to speak on this and settle this lack of uniformity, because it's confusing. And we don't want that, to where something is treated this way in this jurisdiction and substantially different in, we don't want to cross, a state line, for instance. So that's what they're supposed to do. This has gotten kind of crazy. And so really what you're looking at is these district court judges are acting like appellate courts, right, that have bigger jurisdiction. And, of course, the Supreme Court is the largest appellate court. So when you go back and try and locate what's going on with all this stuff, you see that like the Supreme Court in various decisions is kind of like, they're a little skeptical about this, but they haven't done anything. They haven't ruled them unconstitutional. Now, Clarence Thomas has criticized them as being inconsistent with traditional equity practice and an overreach of judicial power. I think that's about it. And Gorsuch said, and there's a case out there, what is it? Department of Homeland Security versus New York, that nationwide injunctions lead to rushed, high-stakes review of policies and create legal chaos. But the Supreme Court hasn't done anything to outright outline what they can do. In other words, say you can't do it, a nationwide injunction, or if you do, you got to do it under these circumstances. Haven't done any of that. Some of the circuits, Fifth Circuit and stuff like this, have narrowed the scope of the nationwide injunctions a little bit over the district courts. But it's still a big problem. And they're getting increasingly used in all these political sensitive cases, right? I mean, let's the Trump-era immigration policies, remember that? The COVID-19 vaccinate mandates, some of these administrative policies that Biden slammed through, have all been kind of come out of that. And even, if you're going to look at it this way, some of the things that they stopped Biden from doing, you got to look at, like the student loan forgiveness. Remember, the Supreme Court had said that he didn't have the authority to do that. Of course, he did loan anyway. That's an interesting, is that overreach? Because there you're starting to try and decide, Or is this a separation of powers thing? Because, see, this is about money. And money is supposed to originate in Congress, be given to the executive. The executive is supposed to administer it based on the sort of generalized will of Congress when they give them the money. So that's a gray area there when it comes to that. So it's a harder one to resolve. Really, we probably ought to abolish these nationwide injunctions. And if you're going to bring something in a court, then its decision ought to only affect people over which it is specifically has jurisdiction. Does that seem hard to understand? We read these things and you think, why is this a problem? Traditionally, these courts were not seen as having national authority, right? And all we've seen is this expansion of judicial power. It's going in the wrong direction here. Not just because we don't like the politics of it, but because it's usurping power out of these sort of gray areas and just saying, oh yeah, well, we think it means this. Well, you don't get to define your own power endlessly, because that's what's happening. Hopefully that'll get changed. Okay, everybody, we're back for a little longer segment here. We got a lot to talk about. Yes, and take that advice from the bumper. Those of you that are in podcast don't hear it, but from the Eagles, great philosophers, don't let the sound of your own wheels drive you crazy. I like to play that every so often because I'm not sure exactly what it means, but it has some message in it that resonates with me for some reason. And I just think that we do that a lot. So, anyway, so as we move forward here, once again, we are coming upon a time of year we talk about elections. All we do is talk about elections anymore. It's terrible. We're not supposed to just be fascinated with this stuff all the time. And government's not supposed to be so important that we have to keep our eye on it like, we're watching a skunk in the backyard. Because if we take our eye off, who knows what's going to happen? Yeah, but that is what's happening. A lot of you, myself included, are living in places where you're going to have municipal elections. Because a lot of them are off year. And they try and have them off year, and usually in some month that's away from a traditional election time. This is often done so that if you have a majority of someone in the area, let's say, I don't know, if there's a fairly conservative area, and you'd like to get some people who are far left nut jobs elected, this is a good time to do it because no one's paying attention. And you can go out and recruit enough of your, fellow travelers here to get somebody in control of something that really affects people on an everyday basis. And we talk about national politics all the time, but these guys that are setting these building codes, setting on sales tax, deciding how the roads are going to be done, making idiot bike lanes out of every kind of place, these affect you every day. And we have a hard time focusing on them because it's a hard time. We have a hard time getting information. Because the campaigns are not big enough to where they're running attack ads on TV all the time or something like that. Like that tells you anything, but at least piques your interest, right? So you don't really know. So the ballot comes, and a lot of people just don't vote because they're not sure. Some people vote based on, guys get the same name as my Uncle Ed. Maybe he's a pretty good guy. Maybe I should, that kind of thing. The other thing is that most of these elections, in many instances, on city councils and stuff like that are specifically sort of like I think of as non-denominational, right? There's not Democrats and Republicans and liberals and Greens and silly party. No, there's none of that. There's just people's names. And so you don't have any information about anybody, and you don't even know kind of where their ideology lies, just like in a general area. You don't even know that. This is great to get people that you don't really want into office. If you're one of those people that want to get them into office and you think everybody else wouldn't want that. This is the way you do it. So we're coming up on that again. In Colorado, we're trying to get a situation where the municipal elections are run at the same time as national or state elections, right? In November. Why? Partly because it's less expensive. I mean, you can have an election, and you're already having one anyway, so the gears and the setup is already going. So your incremental cost to have that election, including the municipal or something like that, is much less than starting everything all by itself. Also, you get this great idea where, people are maybe pay a little more attention when they're electing state officers or things like that, although I haven't seen much evidence of that. But anyway, I'd like to. So we're coming up on that again. And I would just ask you again, like I do all the time, please look at these Nimrods and see, who you're going to vote for. I see city councils and stuff out here with people on them that I know that 70% of the people in the community don't want them there if they talk to them for very long. But there they are. So, and you can't expect the media, I suppose this is media too, but you can't expect like sort of your legacy media or whatever, newspapers, television, people handing out handbills on the side of the road, whatever the case may be. You can't expect them to give you straight information. And everyone wants to direct you to a website. Oh, yeah. Because things you see on the internet are always true. And they're not shaded in any way. And there's no algorithms out there that direct you in certain ways when you try and ask questions. No. So you really have to kind of work hard at it. I think that in many ways, you have to work harder than you did, say, 25 years ago. And some people will say, well, Rick, there's so much more access to information when we can use the internet and, talk to our phones or whatever else we're doing. Yeah, but we've learned not to trust that if we're smart, which means is that not only do we have to try and find things out, but we have to wade through all of this disinformation, as the left likes to call it, or misinformation, or I like to think of it as in simpler terms, untruths. And we have to decide not only what we find out, we have to find out if that's correct. Who's saying it? Why are they saying it? Where did this come from? One of the easiest ways to see how screwy this is that if you're watching the news or reading something that you're involved with, like you drove by where this was happening, or you were at this rally, or whatever the case may be, and you read about it, how often has that happened to you that you looked at it and it doesn't seem like they were at the same event or did the same thing? It happens all the time. Well, that's a good tip-off. It's not like, well, this is one time they were wrong because I was there to notice it. No. You're there to notice it is how you can figure out how they do these things. So, it's a little bit of work. And you have to get kind of more than one viewpoint to be able to sort through what's probably happening. And one of the best ways, of course, is to talk to your neighbors, talk to people around there that might know these characters or something like that. It's sometimes not that real easy. But you got to work on it a little bit. Because it's, like I've said before, where do you think these nut jobs in Congress come from? Remember Joe Biden's first job? Yeah, that's right. Wilmington, Delaware City Council. Could have stopped him there. But no. You think he was any smarter then than he is now? No. He's less able to communicate now, but no brighter then than he is now. I mean, he could talk faster probably. And it just goes flying by. And so you end up with this kind of choice that you don't want, because by the time you do something, you're just sort of checking a box you're not completely understanding because you haven't been able to do the research. It's sort of going to the zoo and trying to find out which of the orangutans you want to have run your country. It's like, I don't want any of them. How do I decide which one? Well, you got to decide on one of them. We don't want that. It's going to happen sooner or later. In some places, just because that's the way of the world is, circumstances come up. But you can stop most of it if you just get out there and do a little bit of research and work and say, hey, wait a second. Aren't you the guy that thought we should take everything in the city and make it like nationalize it or, of course, municify it, something like that? That we should have the city, compete with all of the private companies in some area by using our tax dollars? See, when the city or county or whatever decides to do something that is traditionally done by a private party, do they have some advantages? Yeah. Where I'm at now, they want to talk about, this is really funny. They have meetings all the time to raise impact fees and make it more expensive to build residential construction. Then the next day they have a meeting about affordable housing and why housing is so unaffordable. This is the kind of cognitive dissonance that you think would be obvious, but apparently it's not. So they decide, well, maybe, we ought to get involved in the business. Well, government has periodically gotten in the business of providing housing, and of course it's not went well. Most of these housing projects, just look up Cabrini Green if you want to, just to see kind of like, the staggeringly bad example, but It really usually doesn't work. Government is not sensitive to any of the market forces that people who are using their own money are. And they also, this is why you would think, well, it'd be cheaper, because they will usually waive all these restrictions. The kinds of things that they wouldn't let you do, for a heartbeat, they'll just let themselves do. They won't charge themselves anything or do anything or really restrict themselves in a particular way. Because, why? Well, they know best. So as long as you're comfortable with that. Look at what's going to happen in California. The Pacific Coast Highway out there is, and for those who've been out there, beautiful stretch of road outside Los Angeles. And a lot of the fire was right there. And it stopped at the highway or it jumped over and went all the way to the ocean. Well, there's a lot of houses along there. Some of them, as you might guess, were pretty expensive. So now these people would like to be able to do something with the land that has where their house used to be. So far, the city of Los Angeles hasn't really been able to let them get in and clean out their own debris. However, the city and the state of California are very concerned about toxic chemicals and things like this. Well, when you have a fire and you burn down a house or some kind of commercial structure, there's a lot of things that get destroyed or melted or whatever you want to say within that structure. And if you let it rain on it enough times, pretty soon it runs into the ocean. That's what's been going on for the last couple of months. You need to get out there and get that stuff cleaned up to minimize that if you're really interested about these environmental impacts. But you see, apparently they're not. Because when you have actual environmental impacts you're supposed to be looking at, if it involves what the government wants to do, it's not as important. But it's really a problem out there. And you folks don't have any trouble seeing that. Because most of you listening are people that do things. People who make these rules in government usually are people that don't do things and don't know how to do things. They talk about things, and they talk about how they make other people do things or prevent them from doing things. But they themselves don't really have a lot of insight in how to do something like, build a house, highways, stuff like that. And it's not, they just decide how to spend your money on them. They don't necessarily know how to do it. So this is always a problem in government, and you try and rectify it by electing the right people, assuming you get the right people to run. I mean, we go down that road all day too. But you see how this can turn out, where you have a group of people that are ideologically committed to something, but have absolutely no real-world tools to understand what it really means. Like, you could say, well, great, yeah, we have all this, concern about the environment. This is a perfect time to take quick action to help actual environmental damage. Yeah, but it's not really something we're interested in. Is it climate change? Is it has something to do with, banning something or solar panels? If it doesn't, then they can't get interested in it because they don't understand what it is. So, the people who elect these Jaspers you have to take control of this, because otherwise that's what you get. I'm just saying. The more you look at it, the more you realize that you have a lot of people running things, not because they were chosen, because it just kind of slid through, right? A small group of people really were committed to getting somebody with this kind of ideology in a position of power. They find a time when people aren't paying attention. They band together, push this person through. And then everybody else stands around and going, where are they doing that? What happened? What? The sales tax? Yeah, right. Well, that's how that happens. I'm not saying it's easy. I'm just saying that's what happens. Okay, let's look a little bit at a roundup of what's happening around the world this week, because I like to do this because we don't really hear about it in most of our newscasts anymore. I mean, I think you got more general news. If you're watching the news in 1970 and you had a 30-minute news break, yeah, you got a bunch of left-leaning propaganda from the news heads out there. But you also heard a little bit about something was going on in the world, maybe that was important. Well, you don't even really do that now. We only have one or two things that we're upset about. And it gets talked about endlessly. And it's in the news endlessly. And you think, is that what's happening in the world? Did the rest of the world just slow down Did everybody just stop fighting in these places or stop doing these things that is probably going to end up being important to us at some time? No, it doesn't. We're just involved in this hysterical navel-gazing all the time, and this is what we get when we do it. We get our eye off the ball, things happen, and then we wonder how it happened. All right, let's look at a couple of things here. All right, we'll call to action. I made some of these notes. Let's talk about Russia for a minute. Oh, no, you don't. Russian forces, as you know, have renewed their offensive in eastern Ukraine. And they have attacked. There's a dog outside the window here. I don't understand why the studio. Anyway, people are like, well, they've stepped it up. It's Trump's fault. No, I'm afraid it's not. The Russians see the handwriting on the wall. They see them being pushed towards some kind of settlement. They see that the Ukrainians have made a very bad move for whatever reason and have kind of put themselves in a bad position in terms of supply, intelligence, you name it, right? And because of that, the Russians are taking advantage of it. Because what do you do when you think the war might get negotiated? Is you take as much as you possibly can. I mean, let's be realistic here. The time to have stopped the Russians was in 2014. It wasn't now. I mean, this is the best we can do. And I don't think we have a very good record of that, do we? I was thinking today that let's look at the last time the Russians really took a lot of stuff. And I'm not talking about the Donbass or anything like that. I'm talking about 1945, 1946. The Russians just kind of moved into Eastern Europe, and they just stayed. That's the kind of thing that happens if you don't take action right away. Patton wanted to take action, wanted to push them back. You know, who knows what might have happened there. I'm just saying, if you go back and look at what happened to Europe, I mean, you know, a good half of Eastern Europe just got sucked up by, you know, the Russians. And they were like, nope, we're not giving it back. These, of course, countries are sorely, you know, they're clearly self-governing unless we don't like it. So once the territory has been lost, it's pretty hard to get it back. It took a long time. And so this is what's happening here. In the meantime, in Taiwan and China, there was a whole bunch of big naval exercises that took place this week. Because Taiwan instituted a new defense budget where they upped the amount of money they were going to spend on defense, which of course upset China. So they decided to just, you know, have more exercises in the area, more threatening going on. Some of this was to buy more arms from the United States, so that really did not help them. Now, we've tried to conduct some operations in there. We always call them freedom of navigation, where we sail around, you know, one of our fleets through there to show them that we can, and you don't really control this area and so forth. It's, you know, it's not going to really affect them too much if they don't think we're going to do anything and, you know, support somebody. Middle East, look what's going on there. Hezbollah is still shooting things from Lebanon, and there's been more rocket attacks. So until something happens definitively there, and it could, I think there's a possibility that it could, this is going to keep going on. And our good old friends in North Korea did, in fact, launch an intercontinental ballistic missile into the Sea of Japan. Okay, and there was all these emergency meetings between South Korea, the U.S., and Japan. Did you hear anything about that? No. No, of course not. Because that doesn't have anything to do with whatever it is they're talking about today. I find this really, it's not, people aren't doing their job. They're not letting you tell some of this stuff. You also may know that oil prices surged this last week. Why? Well, because they're worried about Donald Trump getting a lot of our oil reserves pumped out there and lowering the price. So they're going to try and lower their production, raise the price as much as they can during this time to get as much money as they can. It's going to be like $90 a barrel, I think, probably this week. The rest of what's going on, what's happening? Oh, there was a big cyber attack on the European energy grid that they think came from Russian hackers. They're getting pretty good at this, or they're getting really active in it anyway. And they're trying to see if they can target these critical energy infrastructure, right? across the European Union to try and see if they can turn the power off places, turn the internet off, do the kinds of things that we've gotten so used to that if it went down, people wouldn't know what to do next. Yeah, they're very interested in doing that. And in the meantime, in the United States, I thought I'd just bring this up here. We got a couple of minutes. What's going on in our Congress? Well, you saw what was going on in our Congress with some of these guys sitting on their hands during Donald Trump's speech, which is a pretty good speech. Here's just one of my favorite people. This is Representative Hank Johnson, Democrat out of Georgia. Now, somebody's going to go, I know that name. But Hank Johnson, who's been just as dumb as possible for as long as possible, has said that the MAGA movement wants black Americans confined back to picking cotton. Really? I listen to a lot of people that think we got to make America great again. I've never heard one of them mention that. They also he thinks that MAGA people want to kill public education. Kill public education? We'd like to dig public education up from its grave that the Democrats have dug and try and reanimate it. Maybe get people, in 8th grade to start, being able to read at a 4th grade level instead of a 2nd grade level or not at all. They want to think that we don't see somebody who has the IQ of a pocket pen, which would be, that might be too complicated. This is something he said too. And where does that leave us? It puts us back to when America was great and we were picking cotton and all of it. We're doing the productivity that they are putting my Latino brothers and sisters who migrate here to do that work because we are not suited intellectually to do it anymore. I'm not even sure I understand what that is. Maybe I'm not as smart as Hank Johnson. But remember, one of the things remember about Hank Johnson is because he's a master of saying really weird, dumb stuff. And the best example of it, remember a couple of years ago, I guess it's 3 years ago now, where one of the congressmen, when they were talking about deploying more troops to Guam, asked that if we put too many troops on the island of Guam, if it would tip over. Yeah, that's Hank. That's everybody. He's a very concerned person. Other people just talk about the cost of these troops. How are we going to get them there? What's it going to cost to maintain them? Do we need them in that area? But Hank, no, sir. Hank worries that he's going to tip the island over. He's thinking, outside the box. I mean, the box he's thinking outside of is like common sense and reality, but he's well outside that box. So that's what we've got. You know who has to save it? You guys have to save it. And Trump and his cabinet.
Listen, if you'd like to listen to more and you want to maybe perhaps have someone else listen to our podcast, you can do so either by going right to our webpage, politicalviking.com, or therickWagnerShow.com. Both of them take you there. You can get links right directly to our podcast, or you can hear our podcast on Podbean, on iTunes, and Spotify, and a couple others. So you can find us. We appreciate it if you do. And if you've heard the show, you want somebody else to hear it, that's a good way to send it to them. Thanks for listening.